Today I'm going to tell you the story of a rancher who found a dying Apache girl hidden in his barn. Thomas Hartwell discovered young Aiyana discarded as too weak to work by cruel mine owners, but the outcome exceeded all expectations. Please subscribe to our channel and comment where you're listening to this story from. Chapter 1. The Discovery in the Shadows. Thomas Hartwell had been running his cattle ranch in the rugged territory of New Mexico for 12 years, ever since he'd bought the land from a desperate homesteader who couldn't handle the harsh desert climate. The sprawling property sat in a valley between red mesa formations, where sparse grass struggled to grow and water was more precious than gold. It was October 1885, and the autumn air carried the bite of coming winter, mixed with the perpetual dust that seemed to coat everything in this unforgiving landscape. Thomas was a man of routine, rising before dawn to check on his livestock and inspect the property for any signs of trouble. Cattle rustlers were common in these parts, and Apache raids, while less frequent than in previous years, still posed a constant threat. At 42, he had the weathered face and calloused hands of someone who had learned that survival depended on vigilance and hard work. That morning started like any other, with Thomas making his way to the large wooden barn that housed his hay equipment and sometimes served as shelter for sick animals. The structure stood about 50 yards from his modest adobe house, its rough-hewn planks bleached gray by years of desert sun and occasional fierce storms dot as he approached the barn. Thomas noticed that the heavy wooden door was slightly ajar, something that immediately set off alarm bells in his mind. He was meticulous about securing the barn each evening, knowing that even a small oversight could result in lost livestock or stolen supplies. His hand instinctively moved to the Colt revolver holstered at his hip as he cautiously approached the entrance. The interior of the barn was dim, with shafts of morning sunlight streaming through gaps in the wooden walls, creating a pattern of light and shadow across the hay-covered floor. Thomas stepped inside carefully, his eyes adjusting to the lower light as he scanned the space for any signs of intrusion. At first, everything appeared normal. His tools hung in their designated places along the walls. The hay bales were stacked as he had left them, and his plow sat undisturbed in the corner. But as he moved deeper into the barn, a soft sound caught his attention, so quiet he almost missed it over the creaking of the old wooden structure. It was the sound of breathing, labored and shallow, coming from the far corner where old horse blankets were stored. Thomas drew his weapon and moved slowly toward the source of the sound, his boots making barely a whisper on the hay-strewn floor. What he found in that shadowy corner would change everything he thought he knew about survival in this harsh territory. Huddled beneath a pile of dusty horse blankets was a young Apache girl, probably no more than 12 or 13 years old. She was unconscious, her breathing barely perceptible, and even in the dim light, Thomas could see that she was in terrible condition. Her long black hair was matted with dirt and what appeared to be dried blood. Her dark skin was pale from illness or injury, and her clothing, traditional Apache dress made from deerskin, was torn and stained. Thomas lowered his weapon immediately, his rancher's instincts overriding any fear or suspicion. This wasn't a threat. This was a child who was clearly dying. He knelt beside her, noting the extreme thinness of her frame and the way her ribs showed through her clothing. She appeared to be severely malnourished and dehydrated. "Jesus," Thomas whispered, holstering his gun and reaching out to check for a pulse at her neck. Her skin was hot to the touch. She was running a high fever that spoke of serious infection or illness. As Thomas examined the girl more closely, he began to piece together what might have happened. There were rope marks around her wrists, suggesting she had been bound for an extended period. Her feet were bare and bloody, indicating she had traveled a long distance over rough terrain. Most disturbing of all, there were signs of physical abuse, bruises in various stages of healing that painted a picture of prolonged mistreatment. Thomas had heard stories from other ranchers and traders about Apache children being captured and sold into forced labor, particularly in the mining camps and larger settlements where cheap workers were always in demand. The practice was officially illegal, but widely ignored by territorial authorities, who had little sympathy for Apache welfare. At this girl's condition, Thomas suspected she had been discarded like a broken tool when she became too sick or weak to work. Someone had probably dumped her here, perhaps thinking she would die quietly without drawing attention to whoever had been exploiting her labor. The girl stirred slightly, her eyelids fluttering but not opening. She mumbled something in Apache, words that Thomas couldn't understand, but which sounded like a plea or a prayer. Her voice was so weak it was barely audible, like the whisper of wind through desert rocks. Thomas faced an immediate decision that would test everything he believed about right and wrong in this harsh frontier territory. He could report the girl to the territorial authorities, who would likely place her in one of the government schools designed to civilize Apache children institutions that were notoriously brutal and had high mortality rates. He could try to find her family, though Apache bands had been scattered and relocated so frequently that this would probably be impossible. Or he could take responsibility for her care himself, despite the complications this would create with neighbors who viewed all Apache as enemies. Looking at her frail form and labored breathing, Thomas realized that philosophy could wait. Right now, she needed immediate medical attention if she was going to survive the next few hours. Carefully, Thomas gathered the girl in his arms. Surprised by how light she was, she couldn't weigh more than 70 pounds, far too little for someone her age. She didn't wake up during the transfer, though she made small sounds of pain when he moved her. Thomas carried her from the barn to his house, his mind already working through what needed to be done. He would need to get her fever down, clean her wounds, and try to get some water into her before dehydration killed her. Beyond that, he would have to figure out what to do with an Apache child in a territory where such mercy could be seen as treason by his neighbors. As he pushed through the door of his house, Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that this moment would divide his life into before and after. Whatever happened next, he was no longer just a rancher trying to survive in hostile territory. He was now responsible for a life that someone else had discarded as worthless. The girl's fever-hot skin against his arms reminded him that time was running out, and philosophical questions would have to wait until she was stable enough to have a future worth debating. Chapter 2. Fighting for Life. Thomas laid the unconscious Apache girl on his kitchen table, the same sturdy wooden surface where he ate his solitary meals and cleaned his weapons. Under the bright light streaming through the window, her condition looked even worse than it had appeared in the shadowy barn. Her lips were cracked and bleeding from dehydration. Her skin had a grayish pallor that spoke of serious illness, and the fever radiating from her small body was so intense he could feel it without touching her. Moving with the efficiency born of years spent doctoring sick cattle, Thomas began gathering supplies. He had learned basic medical care out of necessity. The nearest doctor was a 3-day ride away in Santa Fe, and in this harsh territory, waiting for professional help usually meant watching something die. First, he needed to bring down her fever before it killed her. Thomas pumped cold water from his well into a large basin, soaking clean rags in the frigid liquid. Gently, he began placing the wet cloths on her forehead, neck, and wrists, areas where the blood ran close to the surface and cooling would be most effective. As he worked, Thomas studied the girl's face more carefully. Beneath the dirt and evidence of abuse, she had delicate features that spoke of intelligence and strength. Her high cheekbones and the proud line of her jaw reminded him of other Apache he had encountered during trading negotiations, people who carried themselves with dignity, even in the face of overwhelming odds. The rope marks on her wrists were deep and infected, suggesting she had been bound for weeks or possibly months. Thomas cleaned these wounds with whiskey, knowing the alcohol would burn, but also prevent the infection from spreading further. Even unconscious, the girl flinched when the liquid hit the raw flesh. "Easy there, little one," Thomas murmured, though he knew she couldn't hear him. "I'm trying to help." After treating her wounds, Thomas faced the challenge of getting fluids into someone who couldn't swallow properly. He had dealt with this problem before with dehydrated calves, using a technique that required patience and care. Using a clean cloth, he dipped it in water and let small amounts drip into the corner of her mouth, waiting for her unconscious swallowing reflex to kick in. The process was maddeningly slow, but gradually he managed to get small amounts of water into her system. Her body was so dehydrated that it seemed to absorb every drop desperately. After an hour of this careful work, Thomas noticed her breathing becoming slightly less labored. As the afternoon wore on, Thomas maintained his vigil beside the kitchen table, changing the cooling cloths and continuing the drop-by-drop hydration process. He found himself talking to the unconscious girl, partly to keep himself alert, and partly because the silence of his house had grown oppressive over the years of living alone. "I don't know what your name is," he said while wringing out another cloth, "or where you came from. But somebody decided you weren't worth keeping alive, and I disagree with that assessment." Thomas had seen enough cruelty in his years on the frontier Apache raids that left entire families dead, soldiers who killed women and children without hesitation, traitors who cheated anyone they thought they could get away with cheating. But there was something about finding this discarded child that crystallized his understanding of what separated civilization from barbarism. As evening approached, the girl's fever finally began to break. The wet cloths were no longer evaporating. Within minutes of being placed on her skin, and her breathing had become deeper and more regular. Thomas allowed himself a moment of cautious optimism. She might actually survive. It was just after sunset when she first opened her eyes. Thomas was adjusting a cloth on her forehead when he noticed her dark eyes staring up at him with a mixture of fear and confusion. She tried to speak, but managed only a weak croak from her damaged throat. "Easy," Thomas said softly, keeping his movements slow and non-threatening. "You're safe now. Nobody's going to hurt you here." The girl's eyes darted around the unfamiliar room, taking in the whitewashed adobe walls, the simple furniture, and the oil lamps that cast warm yellow light across the space. When her gaze returned to Thomas, he could see her trying to assess whether he represented a new threat or possible salvation. Thomas reached for a cup of water he had been keeping ready. "You need to drink this," he said, supporting her head carefully as he brought the cup to her lips. Small sips. She drank greedily at first, then more slowly as her body remembered how to process liquid properly. When she had finished most of the water, she looked at Thomas again, and this time there was something different in her expression. Not trust exactly, but a recognition that he was trying to help rather than harm her. "Can you tell me your name?" Thomas asked gently. The girl opened her mouth to speak, then closed it again, as if testing whether her voice would work. When she finally spoke, it was in Apache, words that Thomas couldn't understand, but which sounded like they might be her. "Name. I don't speak Apache," Thomas admitted, "but we'll figure something out." Over the next several hours, Thomas helped the girl take small amounts of water and managed to get her to eat a few spoonfuls of broth he had prepared from beef bones. Each small success felt like a victory against the forces that had tried to destroy her. As she grew stronger, the girl began to show signs of the sharp intelligence Thomas had suspected. She watched everything he did with careful attention, learning the patterns of care he provided. When he approached with medicine or food, she no longer flinched, though she remained alert to any sudden movements. The challenge now was communication. The girl clearly understood that Thomas was helping her, but they needed to establish some way to talk to each other. Thomas tried simple words in English, pointing to objects and saying their names. The girl listened carefully, but didn't repeat the words, not yet ready to trust him with her voice. It was late that night, when Thomas was dozing in a chair beside the table where she lay, that the girl finally spoke in English. Her voice was barely a whisper, but the words were clear enough. "Why?" she asked simply. Thomas opened his eyes to find her staring at him with that same intense gaze she had worn since awakening. It was a profound question, one that cut to the heart of everything that had happened. "Because leaving you to die would make me the same as whoever put you in that barn," Thomas replied honestly. "And I don't want to be that kind of person." Girl considered this answer for a long moment, then nodded slightly, as if it made sense to her. It was the first indication Thomas had that she might be willing to trust him, at least enough to let him continue helping her recover. "What's your name?" Thomas asked again, hoping that she might be ready to share this basic information. "Aiyana," she whispered, the Apache words sounding like music in the quiet house. "Aiyana," Thomas repeated carefully, trying to pronounce it the way she had. "That's a beautiful name." "I'm Thomas." She nodded again, then closed her eyes, apparently exhausted by even this brief conversation. But Thomas felt encouraged. They had made contact across the vast cultural divide that separated them, and she was going to live. Now came the harder question. What would happen when the rest of the territory discovered that Thomas Hartwell was harboring an Apache child? Chapter 3. The Town's Judgment. 2 weeks had passed since Thomas found Aiyana in his barn, and her recovery had been nothing short of remarkable. The fever had broken completely after 3 days, and with proper food and care, she had begun to regain strength at a pace that amazed him. The rope burns on her wrists had healed cleanly, and the grayish pallor had been replaced by the healthy, bronze complexion that spoke of her Apache heritage. Aiyana had proven to be quick-witted and eager to learn. She absorbed English words with startling speed, building a vocabulary that allowed for increasingly complex conversations. Thomas had fashioned simple clothes for her from spare fabric, replacing the torn deerskin dress she had arrived in. She helped with basic chores around the ranch, though Thomas was careful not to push her too hard, given what she had already endured. The peaceful routine of recovery was shattered on a crisp November morning when Thomas spotted a dust cloud approaching from the direction of Mizia, the nearest settlement. As the riders drew closer, he recognized Marshal Jake Morrison, leading a group of 5 men, their faces grim with purpose. Thomas felt his stomach tighten. Word had somehow gotten out about Aiyana's presence at his ranch, and now he would have to face the consequences of his decision to help her. "Aiyana," Thomas called quietly to where she was feeding the chickens near the barn. "Go inside the house and stay there until I tell you it's safe to come out." She looked at the approaching riders and immediately understood the danger. Without a word, she disappeared into the adobe house, moving with the silent efficiency that spoke of hard-learned survival skills. Marshal Morrison was a man Thomas had known for 8 years, ever since Morrison had taken the job of keeping order in a territory where law and chaos existed in constant tension. He was generally fair, but had little patience for what he saw as sentimental foolishness, especially when it came to Apache relations. "Thomas," Morrison said as he dismounted near the front porch, his hand resting casually on his gun belt. "Aye. Here you've got yourself an Apache girl here on your property." Thomas met the marshal's gaze steadily. "I've got a child who was dying when I found her. I did what any decent person would do." "That's a matter of perspective," said Henry Walsh, the owner of the general store in Mizia, and a man who had never hidden his hatred for all Apache people. Harboring Apache could be considered aiding the enemy. "She's a 12-year-old girl." "Henry," Thomas replied, fighting to keep his voice level. "Not exactly a military threat." Morrison held up a hand to prevent the conversation from escalating. Thomas, you know I respect you, but this situation is complicated. We've had reports of Apache raids increasing over the past month. People are nervous, and when they hear that one of their neighbors is keeping an Apache child ... double quotes. What exactly are you saying, Jake? I'm saying that for everyone's safety, including yours and the girls, she needs to be turned over to the proper authorities. There's a government school in Carlisle that specializes in educating Apache children. Thomas had heard about the Carlisle Indian Industrial School and places like it. They were institutions designed to kill the Indian and save the man, forcing Native American children to abandon their culture, language, and identity. The mortality rates at such schools were appalling, and those who survived often emerged as broken souls caught between two worlds. She stays here, Thomas said firmly. I found her half dead in my barn, abandoned by whoever had been using her as slave labor. I'm not going to hand her over to another institution that might kill her. It's not your decision to make, Walsh interjected angrily. You can't just keep an Apache child like she's a stray dog. There are laws, procedures. Then show me the law that says I can't care for a child who is dying on my property. Thomas shot back. Marshal Morrison looked uncomfortable, clearly caught between his duty to enforce territorial policy and his respect for Thomas as a law-abiding citizen. Thomas, be reasonable. This girl could be a scout for Apache raiders, or she could be carrying diseases. Or, she's been here 2 weeks, Thomas interrupted. She's helped me with chores. She's learning English. And she hasn't shown any signs of being anything other than a traumatized child who's grateful to be alive. At that moment, the conversation was interrupted by the sound of the house door opening. Despite Thomas's instructions to stay inside, Aiyana appeared on the porch, her dark eyes taking in the scene with intelligent assessment. The reaction of Morrison's group was immediate and telling. Hands moved to weapons, bodies tensed, and Walsh actually took a step backward, as if the sight of a small Apache girl posed a physical threat. Aiyana looked directly at Marshal Morrison and spoke in clear, carefully pronounced English. I am not scout. I am not enemy. Men with chains made me work in mine until I get sick. They throw me away to die. Thomas saved my life. The simple statement, delivered with dignity despite her obvious fear, seemed to deflate some of the tension in the group. Here was not the savage warrior they had expected, but an articulate child who had clearly suffered greatly. Morrison studied Aiyana for a long moment, then looked back at Thomas. How do we know she's telling the truth about the mine work? Could be a story to gain sympathy. Thomas rolled up Aiyana's sleeves, revealing the faded but still visible rope marks on her wrists. Does this look like a story to you, Jake? Even Walsh seemed shaken by the evidence of prolonged abuse. Morrison removed his hat and ran his hand through his graying hair, clearly struggling with the situation. Look, Thomas, I understand why. You helped her, and I'm not saying it was wrong. But you have to understand the position this puts me in. If word spreads that Apache children can find sanctuary here, it could draw undue attention from hostile bands. Or, Thomas countered, it could show them that not all white settlers are their enemies. Maybe if we start treating Apache children like human beings instead of vermin, we might find a path to something other than endless violence. One of the other men in Morrison's group, a rancher named Bill Cooper, spoke up for the first time. Thomas has a point. Jake, my wife's been saying for years that this territory won't see peace until we stop treating every Apache like they're personally responsible for every raid. This is ridiculous, Walsh exploded. We're talking about harboring the enemy. What's next? Inviting Apache war parties to dinner? Aiyana stepped forward slightly, her young voice cutting through the argument. My people not all same. Some fight because they angry, because soldiers kill their families. Some want peace, but don't know how to make it. I just want to live, to learn, to not be afraid every day. The eloquence of her words, delivered in English. She had learned in just 2 weeks, seemed to surprise everyone present. This was clearly not the savage that territorial propaganda had led them to expect. Marshal Morrison made his decision. Thomas, I'm going to allow the girl to stay with you for now, but there are conditions. You're responsible for her actions and whereabouts at all times. If there's any sign that her presence here is connected to increased Apache activity, the area shall have to be removed, and you'll need to register her presence with the territorial authority in Santa Fe. That's fair, Thomas agreed, though he wondered how he would enforce such conditions if Aiyana decided to leave on her own dot as Morrison's group prepared to depart. Walsh made one final attempt to sway the marshal. Jake, you're making a mistake. Mark my words, this will bring nothing but trouble. After the riders disappeared into the distance, Thomas and Aiyana stood together on the porch, both understanding that they had won only a temporary victory. The opposition would remain, and Thomas's decision to help her had likely made enemies of some people he had previously counted as neighbors. Thank you, Aiyana said quietly, for not giving me to them. You don't have to thank me for doing what's right, Thomas replied. But you should know that this isn't over. Some people will never accept your presence here. Aiyana nodded, showing the mature understanding of someone who had learned early that safety was always temporary and that survival required constant vigilance. I know, she said simply. But for now, I am not alone. That is more than I had before. Chapter 4. A new beginning. 6 months had passed since Marshal Morrison's visit, and spring had returned to the high desert of New Mexico territory. The winter had been harsh but peaceful, with no Apache raids reported in the area and no further challenges to Aiyana's presence at Thomas's ranch. She had grown taller and stronger, her frame filling out with proper nutrition and the security of knowing she had a safe place to sleep each night. Thomas had registered Aiyana with the territorial authorities as required, listing her as a ward under his protection. The paperwork had been processed without incident, perhaps because officials in Santa Fe were more concerned with larger conflicts than the fate of one Apache girl on a remote ranch. Aiyana had proven herself invaluable around the ranch, not because Thomas expected her to work, but because she insisted on contributing to their shared survival. She had a natural affinity for animals, and the horses responded to her touch in ways that amazed Thomas. Her knowledge of desert plants had also proven useful. She could identify which cacti produced edible fruit, which herbs had medicinal properties, and where to find water during dry spells. More importantly, she had become family in ways Thomas hadn't expected. The lonely rancher who had lived in silence for years now found himself looking forward to evening conversations by the fire, where Aiyana shared stories of Apache traditions while Thomas taught her to read from the few books he owned. On this particular spring morning, Thomas was repairing fence posts when he noticed riders approaching from the east. His first instinct was alarm. Unexpected visitors still made him nervous given the controversy surrounding Aiyana's presence. But as the riders drew closer, Thomas recognized Marshal Morrison, accompanied by a woman he didn't know. Aiyana emerged from the barn where she had been tending to a pregnant mare, immediately alert to the potential danger that visitors might represent. It's all right, Thomas told her, though he kept his hand near his weapon. Let's see what they want. Marshal Morrison dismounted with a slight smile, which was encouraging. Thomas, I'd like you to meet Sarah Crawford. She's a teacher from back east who's been sent by the Bureau of Indian Affairs to evaluate the situation here. Sarah Crawford was a woman in her 30s with intelligent eyes and practical clothing suitable for frontier travel. She studied both Thomas and Aiyana with professional interest, but without the hostility they had come to expect from government representatives. Mr. Hartwell, she said, extending her hand, I've read the reports about your unusual arrangement. Here, I've come to see for myself how things are working out." Thomas shook her hand cautiously. "Aiyana's been no trouble, if that's what you're wondering. She's been a help around the ranch and a good companion." "I can see that," Sarah replied, turning to address Aiyana directly. "How are you doing, dear? Are you being treated well?" Aiyana stepped forward with the confidence she had developed over the winter months. "Thomas is good man. He saved my life and give me home. I learned to read, help with animals, speak English." "Better," Sarah nodded approvingly. "Your English is excellent. Have you been homesick for your people?" It was a direct question that Thomas had been afraid to ask, worried about the answer he might receive. Aiyana considered the question carefully before responding. "I miss some things about Apache Way, but my family was killed in raid 2 years ago. Men who took me from soldiers said I was orphan. Nobody would look for me. Thomas first person to care if I live or die since then." Thomas felt his heart tighten at this revelation. Aiyana had never told him the full story of how she had come to be enslaved at the mine, and learning about her murdered family explained the deep sadness he sometimes saw in her eyes. Sarah made notes in a small book she carried. "And you, Mr. Hartwell, how has this arrangement affected your life?" "Changed it for the better," Thomas answered honestly. "I was becoming bitter, living alone out here. Aiyana's given me purpose beyond just surviving day to day." Marshall Morrison spoke up. "Sarah, I should mention that there was initial resistance from some folks in Nesia, but that's died down. No incidents, no problems. Henry Walsh still grumbles, but even he admits the girl hasn't caused any trouble." Sarah closed her notebook and looked at both Thomas and Aiyana with an expression that seemed almost maternal. "I've been to 3 other locations where similar situations have occurred, and I've never seen anything like this. Usually, when white families take in Apache children, there's either excessive attempts to erase their cultural identity, or the children remain traumatized and unable to adapt." She paused, studying Aiyana carefully. "You seem to have found a balance that preserves your heritage while allowing you to thrive in a new environment. How do you account for that?" Aiyana glanced at Thomas before answering. "Thomas never try to make me forget who I am. He ask about Apache ways, learn some of our words. I teach him about desert plants, he teach me about books. We share, not take from each other." Sarah smiled for the first time since arriving. "That's a very mature perspective for someone your age. Having to survive makes you grow up fast." Aiyana replied simply, after spending several hours observing their daily routine and asking detailed questions. Sarah prepared to leave with what was clearly a favorable impression. "Mr. Hartwell," she said as she mounted her horse, "I'll be recommending to the Bureau that this arrangement be allowed to continue permanently. What you've accomplished here could serve as a model for other situations." "We're not trying to be a model for anything," Thomas replied. "We're just trying to live decent lives. Sometimes that's the most powerful example of all," Sarah said. As the visitors rode away, Thomas and Aiyana stood together, watching the dust settle in their wake. "Did you mean what you said about this being your home?" Thomas asked. Aiyana was quiet for a moment, then looked up at him with eyes that held both the wisdom of her Apache heritage and the trust she had learned to place in this unexpected father figure. "Apache believe that home is not place, but people who care about you. You are my people now, Thomas. This is my home." Thomas felt tears threaten for the first time in years. "Then I guess that makes us family, doesn't it?" "Yes," Aiyana said simply. "Family." That evening, as they sat by the fire sharing their usual meal of beef stew and cornbread, Thomas realized that finding Aiyana in his barn had saved 2 lives, not just one. She had given him a reason to look forward to tomorrow. while he had given her the safety and love necessary to heal from unimaginable trauma. The girl, who had been discarded as too weak to work, had proven stronger than anyone who had underestimated her. And the lonely rancher, who had been slowly dying of isolation, had discovered that family could be created through choice and compassion just as surely as through blood. In the vast, harsh territory of New Mexico, they had created their own small nation of two, bound together by mutual respect, shared survival, and the kind of love that transcends cultural boundaries. It wasn't the life either of them had been born to expect, but it was the life they had chosen to build together, one day at a time.